Hello everyone, my name is Biplab. I'm from the Department of Electrical and Computer Engineering at the National University of Singapore. And today I'm going to talk to you about security and privacy for the Internet of Things. But before I get started, I would like to thank the organizers for giving me the opportunity and inviting me for this talk. Okay, so the idea about this talk is I'll talk about security and privacy issues in IoT at a high level, try to give you an idea about what are the various issues which are out there. And then I'll also talk about some of the solutions that we have. And in particular, I will focus on one specific security challenge, which is security against physical attacks. Okay, so to give you an idea about, just to get started, so the internet, which is so prevalent and common today, started about 55-ish years ago. And back in 1969, when it started, there were only 4 computers on the internet, and they were all primarily in the west coast of US. And the gentleman that you see in the picture here, his name is Leonard Kleinrock, and is considered one of the fathers of the internet. And this large refrigerator-like thing that you see here, that is actually a router, this one. This is the first router that was ever on the internet. And from there, we have come a long, long way, right? And this view graph just shows you how the number of nodes or how the number of computers on the internet evolved over time. And starting from humble 4 computers, now we have come to billions and billions of computers on the internet. And back in the day, maybe 40, 50 years ago, most of the users of the internet were, people working in research in the universities, or maybe people working for military or some organizations like IBM and DEC and so on, right? Not really for regular people. And some of the common applications back then might be email, file transfer, and of course, we use things like WhatsApp and WeChat and so on these days. The precursor for this, the network voice protocol, existed back in 1977, but it's just that the data rates available on the network wasn't very high back in the day, so it wasn't very popular. The whole face of internet changed maybe in the early 90s. Or late 80s, when Tim Berners-Lee invented HTTP and the protocol HTTP. And HTTP made it very, very easy for people to find information on remote computers and to visualize that information and to consume that information. And this resulted in, new applications such as internet commerce, the boom of social media, and more recently, the starting of the shared economy, which, platforms that allow us to buy and sell things or look for services, delivery of goods and online purchases and so on. And, one way of thinking about the evolution of the internet is that, in the pre-internet era, we had the telephone, and the telephone was primarily for human-to-human conversation. And then the first 10 years of the internet in the early 90s was what we call the internet of content. And in this case, people figured out that, we can use the internet for getting information, right? Reading the news, reading email, maybe some entertainment. And towards the late 90s, people figured out, we can actually make money out of the internet. So we have e-commerce companies like eBay, Amazon, they all came up in the late 90s. And also governments started realizing that, we can provide services over the internet. Early 2000s was the internet of people, and this is where social media came into the scene. And services such as Facebook, YouTube, they started becoming popular. And over the last 10 years or so, it has been the Internet of Things. Okay? So the main difference in the Internet of Things is that if you look at the earlier generations of the internet here, So what the internet or a network does is basically you have two parties communicating with each other over the network, right? And in all of these internet of content, internet of services, internet of people, at least one end of that communication is a human, right? So the human initiates, sends or receives an email, right? A human uploads a picture on Facebook. But now we have our devices have evolved so much that we don't really need a human in the loop anymore. So our machines are now smart enough to figure out when they need to generate data, when they need to transfer the data, how to process the data, and how to act on that data. So it's basically machine to machine, and machines themselves are smart enough to figure out when to transfer data and process data and consume that data. And this has enabled this machine-to-machine communication, and the automation that it provides has enabled a lot of different applications, and IoT is being adopted by different industries across the whole spectrum. Common examples would be, smart city applications, smart industry, smart energy, and so on. And it is expected that IoT will have a large contribution to the economy. Now, while there are all these positive things that IoT can bring in, it's not without its own challenges. And one of the biggest concerns with IoT is in the form of security. And over the last 10, 15 years, there have been multiple instances where IoT-based solutions have been compromised by cyber attackers. And that has also led to negative concerns about IoT and its applications and its adoption. So the most common example would be, the nuclear power reactors in Iran, which got hit by the Stuxnet worm. And that damaged a lot of the centrifuges that were used in that nuclear reactor. In 2016 and 2017, the power grid in Ukraine was hit by cyber attackers who were successful in disconnecting certain provinces in Ukraine from the power grid. So tens of thousands of customers in those two provinces, they lost power. So they were without power in the middle of December, which is really, the peak winter season. Other examples are about ransomware. So increasingly we hear about, hospitals, we hear about pipelines, we hear about water and electricity departments being hit by ransomware. And, they have to pay up a large amount of money in order to get their files and their other services back. And another example is Saudi Aramco, which happens to be the largest oil producer in the world. And about 10 years ago, they got hit by a cyber attack, which essentially wiped out all the data from the hard disks and then caused physical damage to the hard disk. And another more recent attack, so these are all examples of industrial systems using IoT that were hacked by attackers and then got compromised. And this is another example where household IoT devices got hacked, and then they were used to launch a cyber attack. And this is the Mirai botnet attack. And in this case, what the hackers did is they compromised a large number of IoT devices. So for devices that generate video, because for launching a denial of service attack, you need to generate a lot of data. So in this case, the attackers hacked into things such as DVRs, video cameras, monitors, and redirected the traffic towards a DNS service provider called DIN. And as a result, when regular users try to access services such as Twitter or Spotify, Amazon, and so on, the DNS service failed. So they were unable to translate the host name to IP address. And as a result, the services were offline. And this is a typical way in which the Mirai botnet worked. So once, let's say the attackers are able to compromise a particular IP camera, let's say, then it tries to find other victim bots. And in this case, they brute forced their way into the new victims by trying out, a dictionary of attacks. So, for example, username and password that is known. So you have a dictionary of these, and then you use it to brute force your way into new victims. And once you find new victims, you send a report to a report server, and then the command and control server periodically checks the status to see if there are any new victims that have been found. If new victims have been found, then the command and control server sends an infect command to the loader. The loader uploads the actual malicious binary into the victim, and now the victim is part of the botnet. And on the day that I want to launch an attack, the command and control server sends an attack command to all the bots in the botnet. And then they redirect their video to the target server. In this case, the target server was the DIN server. And, as we will see in just a bit, that there are a lot of different ways, because there are a lot of different reasons because of which our IoT devices are vulnerable. And in this specific case, one of the reasons was many of these video cameras, when they are shipped with a default username, root username, and a password. And if you know the username and password for one device, you tend to know the username and password for all other similar devices. And then that makes it very easy to break into them. And there's other examples of, people breaking into baby monitors, people breaking and hacking and taking control of vehicles remotely, and so on. And there are also privacy issues with IoT devices. This particular figure shows you one trash can in the city of London. And this had smart sensors which would monitor how full this bin is, right? And if the bin is full, then it would send a command to or send a message to the waste management company to come and empty it, right? But then this bin also had a radio, and what it would do is it would scan nearby users, the phones of nearby users, and try to pair with them, the Bluetooth. And when it tries to pair with you, it keeps track of your MAC address, right? So as you're walking along the street, and there are a number of these bins out there, they essentially can track you by looking at your MAC address. So again, these are privacy concerns that arise. So when we talk about security for the IoT, some of the goals are very similar to security for traditional computing devices, such as authentication, integrity, and confidentiality, right? So these are just the same as we would expect in a traditional computing device. But then there are some other issues that are very, very specific to IoT. So one of the things is that, IoT devices are much more resource constrained. They just operate on a simple battery. They may not have a lot of memory, and they definitely don't have a very fancy processor like our laptops and our phones. So the security protocols that you develop for IoT, they need to be quite lightweight, right? And then a lot of the data that's generated by IoT is personal in nature, right? We have, let's say, wearable devices that we have, and they can capture a lot of your biological data. So we need to worry about privacy in these issues. And ultimately, we generate data, we upload it to various servers, we subscribe to free services from different providers. And the question is, who owns this data? And do you really trust these third-party providers? And one last thing, and we will talk about this a little bit more, about IoT, is the issue of physical security. In many cases, we take these IoT devices and deploy them in the open, by the roadside or, in the corridors. So when you deploy devices like that, people can easily steal them. And they can steal them, and as we will see, then the secrets that are in these devices are not secure anymore. And there are other reasons why IoT devices may be targeted. So, for example, IoT devices are usually always on, and they're never turned off, so they make it easy targets. And in many cases, the manufacturers of IoT devices, they want them to be easy to use. And if I want my devices to be easy to use, I usually skip many of the security solutions. I don't implement them just to make it easy. And a lot of the data that's generated by IoT devices, they have monetary value, so hackers want to get into them. And in many cases, IoT devices are like set up and forget. So we don't interact with them on a daily basis. So even if they're hacked into, we may not know that for a long, long time. And many IoT devices have a large number of vulnerabilities. So some examples maybe, if you open up an IoT device, you would often see that they have ports like this which are left open. So these ports were used during the development phase, but in the end, the ports are still there. And if you open it up and you connect wires to them, you can easily read off the data from the memory and so on. And then there's a whole list of other vulnerabilities such as hard-coded credentials, insecure applications, the absence of encryption and cryptographic solutions for IoT communications. While we update the operating system on our phones and our laptops and desktops quite often, they're much rarer for IoT devices. And there are a large number of security challenges that need to be addressed for IoT. And, some common examples maybe that make life more difficult is, for your phone and for your laptop, desktop, you have a user interface, you have a monitor through which you can interact with the device. But for many IoT devices, there's no interface. So you don't really know what's going on. It's a little more difficult. And also the limited computing and battery power also makes things difficult. And in many cases, the IoT is being used for controlling applications that need to run 24/7. So there's hardly any room for updating, installing patches, and things like that. However, if you want to secure an IoT system, there are a lot of different things that need to happen. So we need a secure data handling framework, and also trust management and establishment of trust is very, very important. We need to ensure that we have secure access control and account management facilities built in. And we also need to make sure that all the communication protocols that we're using, they are secure and they use cryptographic techniques. And then firewalls, the use of firewalls, and then patching of IoT devices is also very important. Finally, if you want to secure an IoT device, it's just not one person's responsibility. It's not just the device vendors, right? It's not just the app developers. The whole ecosystem has to come together, and we need to put in security at different levels. So this would imply, the manufacturers of the devices, the operators of the platform, the network operators, the users themselves, as well as the government, the policymakers, and the regulators. They all have to come together to ensure that everything is in place for IoT to be secure. Okay, so that was sort of a very high-level overview of some of the security issues in IoT. And now for the remaining part, what I will do is I will focus on some specific aspects of IoT security. And the one that I will pick up is physical security. So, when we as humans log on to let's say our email or any online service, the way we kind of verify, the way we kind of authenticate ourselves is through the use of username and password, right? And as a human, I memorize my username and password, and I put it in my head, right? I remember it. But for an IoT device, there is no human involved anymore. So how will an IoT device authenticate itself? So we have to store the username and password of that IoT device in the memory of the IoT device, right? So it's stored somewhere in the memory. But then these IoT devices are deployed out in the open, and then it's easy for somebody to come and steal or pick it up and then open up my IoT device. And previously, like we saw here, if I open up the IoT device, it's quite easy for me to read off the memory and then figure out what the username and password is for that device. So in this case, if the device is stolen, then my security is compromised. So how do I secure my IoT devices against this physical security threats? So one solution there is to use hardware security primitives. So in this case, the idea is, can I, so for example, if I were to come to Thailand, at the airport, I would have to use my fingerprints, right? I would have to put my fingerprints, and then they will verify my fingerprints against some database, and then they say, okay, fine. So can we have some of these hardware level fingerprints and use them for authentication instead of username and password? Right? And it turns out that we actually can. So during the fabrication of the integrated circuits that go into the into the assembly of the IoT device, we can actually create physical and clonable functions that will act as fingerprints of the device. So let me give you an example of that, right? So this is our typical integrated circuit manufacturing process. We will start off with a silicon substrate, and then we'll put a masking film on top. Then we put a layer of photoresist, and then whatever circuit we want to build, we have a mask according to that circuit, and then we shine ultraviolet rays on top. And after that, we take off the mask, and then we do a series of etching and stripping, and then finally we have the circuit that we want. And it's the high-level overview. And this is what the mask may look like. We may have let's say we want wires that are like this. And if you look at the actual layout, the lines are very sharp. These are at 90-degree angles and so on, right? But when we actually manufacture them, things are not exactly like that. There are these round edges, and the length of the wires that we built may not be exactly the same down to the nanometer. And it turns out that when we manufacture it, there's always some variation. So these are different technology levels. So for example, when we are manufacturing something at 45 nanometer, let's say I want to make a gate which is 28 nanometer. It'll usually have a variation about 2 nanometers and so on, right? So there's some tolerable variation. Now, in general, our circuits will operate okay with these kinds of variations. But now what we want to do is we want to exploit this variation to our benefit. And here's one example of how we can create these fingerprints out of these variations. So let's say I have these 2 rows of multiplexers, and these multiplexers are feeding into this flip-flop here. And this is the selection bit that I'm giving to each of these multiplexers. And here I give a 0. So I pick the 0 input of both the multiplexers. Here again, I have a 0. So I pick the 0 input of both multiplexers. Here I have a 1. So I pick the 1 input of both multiplexers. So if I give the same input to both of these rows, at the end, I have 2 paths. There's a blue path that comes in, and there's a red path that comes in into the flip-flop. So by design, these 2 paths are exactly identical. So if I give a clock edge here, the clock edge should reach both of them at the same time, both the inputs of the flip-flop at the same time. But as we just saw, there are variations in the lengths of the wires, right? So when we manufacture this, there will still be variations in the length of the wires that are here. And either the blue wire or the red wire will be shorter. Which one will be shorter? We don't know, right? That's going to be completely random. So if I manufacture the same device again tomorrow, maybe the red line is shorter. If I manufacture it again the day after, maybe the blue line is shorter. So we really cannot control, right? So the output of this is completely a function of the hardware that I manufactured that day. And because of variations that occur randomly, we cannot fully control this. So if I have a large number of these things in parallel, so instead of having one random bit at the output, I can have a large number of random bits at the output. And this